Time. Good morning and welcome to the 27th meeting in 2012 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Can I just remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, Blackberries, etc. I welcome to the meeting and to the committee our new member, Jamie Hepburn, who replaces Bruce Crawford. I would also like to thank Bruce for his brief but productive time on our committee, and I certainly hope that Jamie lasts somewhat longer than his recent predecessor. It's been a bit like musical chairs of late. Okay, so our first item of business this morning is to deal with the declaration of interest from our new member. I therefore invite Jamie Hepburn to declare any interest relevant to the remit of the committee.
Well, I'll see how it goes, Convener, and see if I share your hopes for a long spell in the committee. Nothing to declare specifically, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. We therefore move to our second item of business this morning, which is to decide whether to take item 5 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. And the third item on our agenda is to take evidence from John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth, on improving employability. The Cabinet Secretary is accompanied today by Hugh McAloon and Tom Craig from the Scottish Government. I'd like to welcome the Cabinet Secretary this morning and invite him to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the committee's discussions on employability, which I welcome. Helping people to find, sustain and progress in work is a key priority of the Government. The goal is closely linked with our purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth. It is also a clear social imperative, as we know that good quality sustained employment increases an individual's financial independence, their confidence and self-esteem, with far-reaching benefits for the whole community. As the committee will know, we have recently launched Working for Growth, a refresh of the employability framework for Scotland. The aim is to ensure that our approaches to helping people into work remain appropriate during what is clearly a very difficult economic and financial climate. We have promoted closer and better working between Skills Development Scotland and Job Centre Plus, so that people who are unemployed could more easily access the appropriate careers advice and training available for them. Taking a person-centred approach, Working for Growth describes what we are doing to better understand and address the diverse barriers to work that people face. These barriers may range widely from issues such as childcare to addictions or to a lack of confidence or skills. As entry to the work programme is mandatory for those who are longer-term unemployed, our focus is very much on prevention and on making effective early interventions for a range of clients. I know that the committee have already heard from my colleague Angela Constance about the significant investment we are making to help young people. The committee will also have heard about the recent Women's Employment Summit, which I hope will be a platform for genuine innovation in the months ahead. Underpinning all of these efforts is an emphasis on getting the best possible value from the range of investments that we make. Working for Growth describes how we will introduce a procurement reform bill within the current parliamentary term. Amongst other things, the bill will set an expectation that community benefit clauses will be considered for all major contracts across the public sector in Scotland. The framework also includes details of a new approach to employability funding. The Employability Fund will see our existing employability investments through SDS and the Scottish Funding Council brought together from next year in a new partnership-led commissioning process. The aim will be provision that is better tailored to the needs of people and local labour markets. The fund will deliver 25,500 individual training opportunities in 2013-14, which of course is in addition to the 25,000 modern apprenticeships to which we are committed to in each year of this Parliament. Working for Growth also means that we must work better with employers. Next month we'll see the launch of our Skills Force. Hosted by Skills Development Scotland, this is a new online and contact centre service aimed at improving access for employers to information on training, recruitment and workforce development. Over time, I expect this service to be further refined and enhanced, and I will also look to local partnerships to further enhance their own offer to employers. As part of our wider economic strategy, the Government is acting to protect jobs and to stimulate growth. In closing, Convener, I would highlight that we are also strengthening leadership in support of our goals. Next month I look forward to chairing the first meeting of the reconstituted Scottish Employability Forum to help ensure the profile of employability and that our approaches are properly integrated. The forum will now be chaired jointly by Scottish, United Kingdom and local government representatives. As such, I believe it will be well placed to set the national direction in employability in the coming years. I'm very happy to answer questions in the committee.
Thank you very much for that opening statement, Cabinet Secretary, and of course as a normal practice with which you are well versed, I will start with a few opening questions and then open the session out to other members of the committee. I just want to take you back to 4th of October when we had the employability debate on the Chamber, when the Minister for Youth Unemployment commented on the Employer Recruitment Initiative. And she stated, and I quote, that in effect what we have in mind is a wage subsidy scheme that will be targeted at the smallest employers. We will look to subsidise employment for, say, 6 months. However, that level of detail is not battened down yet. And I'm just wondering if you can provide us with more detail of that particular initiative, and also give us a wee bit more detail on the funding that's being made available in the draft budget 2013 to support the government's various employment initiatives.
First of all, Convener, on the employer recruitment incentive, this, I think it would be fair to say, is a departure of government policy. We have previously not been actively involved in what one might call wage subsidy schemes. The rationale for us embarking on this has largely come from a view that ministers have formed relevant to the current economic circumstances, that it is very clear in a variety of different areas that the current prevailing economic conditions are making it more difficult or less likely for people to commit to particular investments, whether that's about investment in capital plant, or whether that's investment in new business development, or whether it's investment in taking on extra staff. And we feel that because of that circumstance, we have to move into a place where the government previously hasn't been involved in providing some further assistance to employers to actually take on members of staff. And the employer recruitment incentive will total in 2013-14 £15 million of public expenditure being allocated from the government's direct budget. I would expect that sum of money to be at least matched by European Social Fund investment, and obviously there will be contributions towards that from employers who are paying for staff into the bargain. And our aspiration is essentially to put together a very focused initiative which will enable at local level partnerships to be able to work with local employers to encourage people into employment. So that's the thinking behind it. It's focused very much on the needs of individual labour markets and of ensuring particularly that SMEs who face the challenge of supporting new employment recruitment to be able to respond positively to that initiative. In relation to your second question, Convener, which talked through a range of, asked about the different skills programmes that the government has available. We do have a number of different interventions. The Modern Apprenticeships programme, for example, costs approximately £77 million. The Get Ready for Work programme, about £28 million. Training for Work, £8.3 million. There are also a range of other schemes, Community Jobs Scotland, about £6 million, and some of the resources that we've deployed on support for young people, particularly in areas of greatest need, totals about £9 million. So there's a range of different interventions, in addition to, of course, the funding the government makes available for the higher and further education sector in terms of educational development.
Okay, the initiative which I talked about, the Employer Recruitment Initiative, is it not quite similar in some respects to the initiative that ended in March 2012? Where Skills Development Scotland previously offered businesses up to £2,000 when recruiting an employee or a modern apprentice.
I think we're going further in the level of support that we're providing, Convener. The type of assistance we were providing in the previous initiative was very much related to costs of employment, the costs that fall on employers, the additional areas of burden that may come from for example, a sole trader employing somebody else for the very first time, so they're essentially going into new territory. The employer recruitment incentive is designed to provide support directly to individual companies to assist in the salary costs of young people, which is a departure for the government.
Thank you. And one of the things that we picked up in when we went out to Dumfries and Galloway and Dundee and indeed Drossel constituency to meet with some service users and people from the public and private sector who are involved in employability initiatives, and indeed people who were delivering those in the third sector, was there was a bit of frustration about the fact that sometimes these programmes are very focused on very narrow groups. And I'll just give you one example. You know, during the pilot, Community Jobs Scotland had a project aimed at 18 to 24-year-olds. But in actual fact, it's now available to 16 to 19-year-olds. And we had a situation at Drossen where Michael McMahon and I were, along with Jim and Ross Burnside, that we were advised by a 21-year-old that he's now too old for this scheme. And there is a concern that that some of these are a bit too inflexible in terms of the age criteria. I mean, not to mention, obviously, older workers, you know, people in the 40s, 50s, whatever. What's your view on that, and why did they decide, given the pilot was for people up to 24, to restrict it to those from 16 to 19?
Part of the thinking, convener, has been, I think, to address what I think is a widely held concern across the country about the levels of youth unemployment. And I think that in the nature of these programmes, there is obviously a choice between you know, breadth and focus. There'll always be a choice in these programmes, and I suppose you know, I don't think there's a I don't think there is an absolutely hard and fast rule about how a programme can be best designed given some of these conditions. But I think to ensure that programmes can be effectively targeted, that they can be effectively marketed to the individuals that are affected, establishing some parameters to the programme is essential to give some focus to the offering that's been made into the marketplace. Now, I think what is important to remember is that there are a whole range of different areas of provision that exist within the marketplace, and what we are trying to do is to ensure that we have a sufficient range of interventions that will meet the needs of citizens who are looking for work, and to meet their expectations of what can be achieved.
In round tables, and again at the kind of seminars we held, there was quite a concern about evaluation, you know, about what evidence there really was in terms of what programmes were working and what weren't. There would be all sorts of evidence from across the board. So I'm just wondering how the Scottish Government evaluated their employment initiatives in terms of informing the Scottish Government on how it would allocate money in this regard with regard to 2013-14 budget.
The key consideration for the government is that we look essentially at the outcomes that are achieved by particular programmes. Now, what the government hasn't done is undertaken a self-standing independent evaluation of all of these programmes to then decide, shall we continue funding? We haven't done that, and obviously I've seen the committee's lines of inquiry about this point, and obviously we'll look with great care at what the committee recommends in that respect if there is a sense that we need to consider more external evaluation of these programmes. I think there's clearly a case for that. The judgment that we've come to is that we should focus essentially on the outcomes of what programmes are achieving on an ongoing basis, and where we think those outcomes are acceptable, then in the current economic circumstances we will continue to support those programmes, and where the outcomes are perhaps not as strong as we would like to see, we then revise and restructure those programmes. Now, of course, there's no certainty that all of the changes you would then make to a programme will improve those outcomes, but you know, you can simply deploy your best thinking to try to do so. Now, one example that I would give is that on the Get Ready for Work programme, the positive destinations in terms of job outcomes are about 24%, and in terms of wider positive outcomes of going into jobs or into further training or education, it's at a higher level of 39%. Now, we consider that to be on the low side. So as a consequence of that, we've drawn together the Get Ready for Work programme, the Training for Work activity into the new Employability Fund, which will bring even closer together the interventions that are available to be deployed by Skills Development Scotland and the Funding Council, so that these are more focused on providing a more comprehensive support to individuals through the person-centred approach that I referred to in my opening remarks. So I think essentially what we do to evaluate is to look at the outcomes that are achieved, and if we consider that there is a better way to achieve higher outcomes, we will follow that. But I would reiterate that the government hasn't undertaken a formal, independent, external evaluation of these programmes, and obviously I'll listen with great care to what the committee says in that respect.
Thank you. Just one final question before opening things out to the committee. And members were and have been struck by some of the excellent work that has been done by third sector organisations in terms of helping people furthest from the jobs market, get some of the skills required to actually get them to that market. But one of the things that was raised with us was the fact that the annualised funding arrangements make things very difficult for long-term planning, and of course it makes it difficult in terms of some training programmes, which of course are much more long-term, because some are constructing such programmes, because obviously some people need much more intensive support than others. So it was just to see whether this is an issue which you would look at in order to perhaps give greater financial security to third sector bodies who are providing this important employability support.
What I'd say, Convener, is that we've tried for some time, and there is increasing evidence of this, of actually expanding the duration of financial support that's given to third sector organisations. So, for example, when I set out a 3-year budget, I do so on the basis that I encourage other organisations to set out 3-year budgets and to deploy those particularly to third sector organisations where I accept that interruptions of funding can be a real issue for those organisations. The second point is that we have, of course, had particularly tailored initiatives in the third sector on Community Jobs Scotland, which has been a programme which has been deployed exclusively through third sector channels. And I think there's, we're looking carefully at the progress of Community Jobs Scotland to determine what further support we can deploy in that area. And finally, Kavira, a lot of the activity around the employability strategy is taken forward, and this is not something that's new. This has been essentially the characteristics of the employability support that was put in place in 2006. Is that much of this activity is undertaken through employability partnerships in each of the 32 local authority areas. And in that, the government has given a tremendous amount of encouragement to employability partnerships to utilise the capacity of the third sector at local level to find solutions that meet the needs of individuals and to provide some of the flexibility that you referred to earlier on.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to open the session out to questions, and the first person to ask questions will be Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you said in your opening comments that all of the individual initiatives were all dependent on growth in the economy. I think you certainly indicated that the growth was important in terms of delivering on a lot of these areas. In the evidence that we've taken from witnesses, there has been a real sort of emergence of a demand for evidence and a focus on where public spending goes so that we can achieve that type of growth. For example, the Scottish Enterprise identified that at best 1 in 10 small companies have got the capacity to grow. And last week, Professor Kay indicated that we should be looking at areas where there's already growth and supporting them rather than looking at areas where we would like to see growth, we would wish to see growth. would you like to comment on the comments that we've had in terms of, you know, this focus being required on where we can actually achieve the growth?
I think this point gets to the heart of the reforms that I put in place of Scottish Enterprise and Hans Ans Enterprise in 2007, because I agree entirely with Professor Kay that, you know, growth will only come from the places where you can get growth, which is, you know, it might seem like a statement of the bleeding obvious, but I think it's absolutely correct. As a consequence of the reforms we undertook in 2007, we asked Scottish and Hans Ans Enterprise to identify the companies with growth potential in the Scottish economy, to then provide intensive support to those companies to assist their growth. And then the remainder of the company base would essentially be supported by the business gateway, and as you know, and as their growth plans emerged, some of these companies may become account managed companies with growth potential, because the grouping of companies with growth potential will never be a static group. That will change. There will be new entrants will come into that as a consequence of new business ideas or about business changes. So the focus of the enterprise agencies is very much on identifying the companies that have the capacity to grow and supporting them. And one of the key points that I'd make to the committee, and I think I've made this point in Parliament before, is that account managed companies are not just, you know, the great companies, the great big companies of Scotland. Account managed companies can be two-person companies. I was visiting one down in Leith a few weeks ago, Skoog Music, and it's two people who have left academia to set up a business down off Leith Walk, and they're doing tremendous things, and there's just two of them, but they're account managed. They've got a particularly innovative product, and they have the capacity, they are growing and they have the capacity to grow. So I think the analysis that the committee has heard, I think, is correct, and it is reinforced by the changes the government has made. And obviously we try in all of our activities to make sure that the steps we take are properly connected to make sure that we can maximise the effectiveness of supporting the growth direction of individual companies.
And going back to the comments that the convener made when we went out to Ardross, and that was the evidence that we heard, a lot of these companies, some of them that gave evidence to us, work very closely with Scottish Enterprise, with Business Gateway, with the local authorities and others who want to be involved in delivering training and taking people forward into employability. But their experience was that there was too much of a tick box, that there was a headcount process taking place. And when you talked about a focus on outcomes, what they were saying was that the outcomes seemed to be get as many people through the system as possible so we can count them and say that we've been successful, rather than actually counting the number who stayed in employment or who were on to full-time employment having gone through the scheme. And do you take that criticism on board?
Well, obviously, if you heard that, then clearly that was what was expressed by companies. What I would reassure the committee about is that the government does not consider a successful outcome to be getting a number of people onto the programme. You know, I've gone through already with the committee some of the outcome statistics that we have on, without repeating the ones I gave on Get Ready for Work, on Training for Work. 56% of individuals that come through the programme went on to sustained employment, and that's, you know, getting on for a better position. But we also have to remember that some of the individuals that we're talking about face some significant challenges in trying to get into employment, and I accept that we've got to do take particular steps and be particularly intensive in the support that we offer to try to help people who are very far from the labour market to get into the labour market. But I certainly can assure the committee that I don't look at these programmes and just think, well, that's job done because we've got all the places filled. The job is only done when we can see successful and positive outcomes of skill enhancement, sustained employment, sustained learning opportunities pursued by individuals. And these are the measures that we look for in all of the programmes that we take forward.
I think the evidence, I'll just finish on this, the evidence that I certainly heard and the impression that was created for me from a range of service providers and individual companies was that they would rather see a smaller number of intensively supported people rather than a wider number of generally supported people. And I think that was you're talking about focus. What they wanted to see was a focus. That they felt that somehow people were being foisted on them who were not prepared, not suitable for the type of training that was being provided, but they were being put to these companies because a certain number had to be got through the system, and that was being counterproductive.
Well, I think I would be concerned if that was the case, because I fully accept that individuals will have different needs and issues to overcome to enter the labour market. And what we have to make sure is that before any individual goes, there's some people that you simply would be wasting an employer's time to send them to that employer without giving them the preparatory support that is required. Now, some of the programmes that operate are providing very, very focused support to individuals to overcome some of their challenges. Some of it may be about some things which some of us might think to be relatively easy things to overcome about timekeeping or whatever, but for some other people these can be enormous hurdles to overcome. There may be issues of drug or alcohol addiction to overcome. There may be issues, as I said in my statement, in my opening remarks, about access to childcare, which is it's all very well saying to somebody, get yourself to a job. If they've got nobody to look after the children, then it's not the direction of the encouragement isn't worth the effort. So I do accept the point that it is important that people are prepared to be ready for work, and I certainly will listen with great care to what the committee says in this respect as to whether there is more can be done to try to address that in the way the government goes about these programmes.
Just the Cabinet Secretary made reference to something which I think I would like to just add to the comments I'd made earlier. Some of the preparatory work that was being discussed by these employers and service providers, they were referring to the preparatory work being done in schools, so that young people had an expectation of what sort of training they would could expect, should expect, and what the service providers could look to expect from those young people. But there was a bit of a concern that Skills Development Scotland, in moving towards self-assessment, computer-based or IT-based self-assessment, they were disengaging from that preparatory work.
No, I think it's a different way of doing the task, and I would contend that it's a more relevant way of doing the task. So I think the work that Skills Development Scotland is taking forward on the world of work, and I'm not sure if the committee has been briefed on this by Skills Development Scotland. I think for the young cohort of Scotland, of which I am not a part, it strikes me is that the world of work is actually well positioned to address the way in which young people are increasingly acquiring information and taking forward their own their own plans and their own aspirations. Having said that, the education system clearly identifies young people who require greater and more intensive assistance than others, and so it should. And the schemes and the approaches that the government has have got to address much of that into the bargain. The one general comment I would make to Mr McMahon is that, of course, Curriculum for Excellence is designed as a system to try to engage young people in some of the, with all the flexibility that I think is required in this area, to equip them for the challenges of the world of work, and therefore the whole curriculum of Scottish education is now much more focused on equipping young people for the world of work than it has been in the past.
I agree with the comments that Michael has made, but I have to say that at Drawson, that one of the companies there was a call centre company, another one was a hotel, and I think it's more people sent from DWP that they have complaints about rather than necessarily Scottish government programmes. That they certainly came in for more criticism.
On that point, Convener, I think there is obviously the work programme is dealing with individuals who've been out of the labour market for more than 9 months, and in that respect I think we accept this point about the circumstances of people who've been unemployed for less than 9 months, who are the cohort that we are essentially supporting. We accept that those individuals require additional support to be made ready for employment, and that's going to be, in many cases, ever more the case in people who've been unemployed for more than 9 months.
I think there is a real issue about, obviously, Scottish and UK governments working together on this whole issue, of course, and particularly the DWP seem more target-driven in getting folk to an employer. There's also an issue, of course, that came up about employers being fed up by getting phone calls from umpteen different organisations all trying to place people with them rather than from one central focus.
Make a couple of comments on that, Convener. One is that I would want to make clear to the committee that, notwithstanding all the rest of the political discourse that goes on, the Scottish and United Kingdom governments have had a number of very productive interactions on the issues of employability. I would say it's an area where we work well together. The Scottish Employability Forum is going to be jointly chaired by on a rotating basis between myself, the Secretary of State for Scotland, and the President of COSLA. I say that I'm a COSLA representative, I should perhaps correct myself. And that is designed to essentially signal the need for integration and cooperation in this respect. So that's a key point in what we undertake as a consequence of this activity.
Thank you. Jamie, to follow by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to pick up on the Working for Growth initiative that the Cabinet Secretary referred to in his opening remarks. And the Cabinet Secretary said that this takes a person-centred approach. I just wonder if you could spell out what that means. What does it mean for the person who seeks to engage with it?
Well, essentially, the person-centred approach is designed to acknowledge some of the ground that I've discussed with Mr McMahon already, that each individual has to be properly supported to encourage and nurture their journey back into employment. So for some individuals that will be, it might be a kind of minor intervention of encouraging them to look at particular information about vacancies or taking forward particular skills training. In others, it may be more fundamental about assessing some of their fitness and ability to commence employment. And that requires much more intensive support and very focused support. So the key priority of the person-centred approach is to ensure that in all circumstances the individual gets the support that they require to assist them into employment.
You also suggested that it was recognised that this approach could work better with employers. I'm just wondering if you could flesh that out a little. What wasn't working so well and what's going to be better now?
I think this is where I have some sympathy with one of the remarks the convener just made about the fact that employers sometimes feel inundated with requests to be involved in some scheme or initiative or other. I was one of the National Economic Forums we had in this building. It was just across the road, Dynamic Earth, the National Economic Forum. I was involved in a subgroup that was looking at support for employers and getting people into employment, and there were a whole variety of different individuals from public sector organisations setting out, we do this and we do that and we do the next thing, and it was all terribly encouraging and very, very good, very comprehensive. And this guy gets up at the back and says, listen, I run a small business in Glasgow and I didn't have time to keep up with you lot. And it was a very potent reminder of, and it's had a real effect on me. I can tell the committee that businesses are busy. People have got a lot to do, and therefore the type of approaches we take have got to be very focused on ensuring that if an employer is remotely interested in taking on an extra member of staff, we don't send them from pillar to post checking this website, that website, this programme, the next one. It's a very focused approach, which is what the person-centred approach is designed to try to do and to help in that respect. So that will manifest itself in a number of different ways, principally through the development of our skills force, which is designed to simplify the way in which employers can find staff to be recruited. And that initiative will be launched on Friday by the Minister for Youth Employment.
And are employers engaged with this process? They're on
Very
board.
much so, yeah.
Can I ask, Convener, about a slightly different area through the work of the other committee? I'm on the Welfare Reform Committee. We have the convener of the committee here as well. I'm sure he would agree with me that committee has gathered much evidence to suggest that the likely impact of some of the UK government's welfare reform agenda is going to be negative on some of the individuals we're talking about who are removed from the job market. It might also make it more difficult for some people who don't fall into this category, might be brought into this category. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how is the Scottish Government focusing its efforts? How is it bearing in mind this particular issue in terms of its strategies?
It's just implicit in our approach that clearly, and I made reference to this in my earlier remarks about early intervention, that clearly whenever an individual is in a situation where they are looking for work, whatever has prompted that, whether they've lost their job or whether they've lost their benefits, we've got to make sure that the earlier we intervene in that, the better. And our programmes, because we are dealing with people who've been unemployed essentially for less than 9 months, we need to make sure that the approaches we take are prompt, are focused, meet the needs of the individuals concerned. And that essentially has been a major part. The whole welfare reform agenda has influenced our thinking that we must increasingly be focused on the specific needs of the individual. And if I could characterise the shift of activity that's taken place in our programmes, we've moved away from essentially a programme-driven type of approach to an approach that is much more focused on the individual. And I think that will stand us in as good a stead as we can possibly stand in dealing with the implications of welfare reform. Having said that, I think as Mr Hepburn will be familiar from other comments made by the First Minister and by the Deputy First Minister, and I've made these comments myself, it would be impossible for the Scottish Government to protect all of these individuals and all of Scotland from the implications of welfare reform, because I think as the committee, the Welfare Reform Committee that Mr McMahon and Mr Hepburn serve on, has detected, there will be a very significant impact on the Scottish economy as a consequence of welfare reform.
Jean, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I wanted to ask you, I'm really pleased to hear the last statement that it's about the individual and also the awareness of some of the welfare reforms that are happening. Also, I wanted to ask, in the light of some of the small social enterprises that have grown up in recent years, really, and who are employing some of the hard-to-employ people who had, until that time, probably been using more health services and using care centres and so on, rather than getting into a pattern of getting up and going to work. Now, the funding for some of these small enterprises, and they are quite small, I mean, sometimes employing maybe as few as 6, 10, 12, 20 people at most in the region that I represent. But I wonder if there's any connection or how you see that link working between the health service and the potential cost that the cost that they did have in terms of commitment to funding for social enterprises who are constantly looking to have their contract renewed, and sometimes that's not. That's the hardest thing. I mean, they concentrate on the next year's funding as soon as they've kind of found for 1 year. So it seems to me that there's a wee bit of joined up thinking that needs to be looked at about that. And often I suspect that when their application goes back to local authority for funding, it's being looked at in terms of services that the local authority will deliver itself, rather than looking at a health service budget or implications of not funding or not continuing to fund. And I know it's funding, long-term funding is always difficult. The other thing I wanted to say was that I have recently been quite shocked at the DWP in terms of fairly vulnerable people being helped. And again, coming back to your comment about it being about the individual, computer-generated letters that arrive just at the point, perhaps when somebody's beginning to have their confidence built by the kind of support systems that are in place, threatening with either withdrawing housing benefit or other benefits that they have, at the point where there's beginning to be links made. And I appreciate that that's not something maybe that you, but just that you could be aware of that.
I think to deal with the first point that Jean Urquhart has raised, I think this gets to the nub of the government's public sector reform agenda, where we have opted to take forward an approach in response to the recommendations of the Christie Commission, which is founded on a number of key elements, two of which are relevant to this point. One is about the focus on prevention, and the second is about collaboration and integration of public services at local level. And if I can just explore some of those points, it is in the interest of the whole of the public sector that, for example, an individual who has a mental health problem is properly supported and nurtured and encouraged into employment, where they have a routine and they are able to make a meaningful contribution to society, rather than that individual not getting support, getting into difficulties, which can end up either in a healthcare situation, which, without wishing to sound endlessly like the finance minister, which costs an awful lot more, or in an even worse outcome, which is in prison, which is where lots of people with mental health problems end up. So the prevention agenda is absolutely vital to making sure that we have the right steps taken to support people and to get them to a good outcome, which is why the person-centred approach is important. The second element of that is, of course, in relation to cooperation and collaboration at local level. It is just not good enough for public bodies to say, well, they're not presenting as a health service problem, or they're not presenting as a local authority service problem, so we'll just not do anything. Because what happens then is people fall between stools, and then my earlier scenario prevails, and they end up either needing more intensive and costly public service support, either in a hospital, an institution, or regrettably in a prison. So getting the preventative interventions correct is absolutely fundamental to what we must do at local level. To assist that process, particularly in the grouping that Ms Urquhart's talked about, we have invested a huge amount of effort in supporting the development of the social enterprise sector. It's something that I set out as a policy objective in 2007 to achieve, which was to make the social enterprise sector larger and more comprehensive as a consequence of government intervention. And happily, we are in that situation now. The job is not complete, it is still growing as a sector, and the government continues to support that with a range of different interventions to try to strengthen the capacity of social enterprises through principally the Enterprise Growth Fund and also the Just Enterprise Business Support Programme, all of which are targeted towards social enterprises to strengthen their capability to fulfil these areas. So I do see a significant role for people with vulnerabilities to be supported by social enterprises. From my experience, social enterprises are more successful in getting people who are very remote from the labour market into the labour market than public sector organisations are, and that's why we're trying to improve that capacity. To move on to the second point of Ms Urquhart's point, if you get a letter in the post which gives you a bit of kind of shocking revelation about what your benefit situation is or whatever, it can set people back. I've dealt with constituents in exactly that circumstance, and I think that is where I would make a plea for all of our interventions to be effectively joined up, because if an individual is being supported through one channel but then undermined by another channel, then that most definitely does not deliver the best for the individuals concerned.
John, to be followed by Gavin.
Thanks so much. One area that we've heard a little about is the whole area of skills shortages, that despite the fact some people can't get jobs, there's other jobs that seem to be finding it hard to get people, and looking forward that would appear to include the engineering sector. I believe Scottish Power have a lot of people retiring soon, North Sea Oil, that kind of area as well. But other areas too, like hospitality, which is not always seen as career opportunities. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can deal with that. I mean, I think the schools are involved in that. If your feeling is the schools are doing enough to point people in the right direction, and also the universities. We did ask one of the universities, are they training too many of one kind of thing and not enough of another, e.g. engineers? And they seemed to suggest it wasn't their role to decide that. They would just reflect what people wanted to do.
This is quite a deep-seated and complex area, but it's one that has to be resolved if we are to avoid the situation which I all too frequently find myself in, of having a conversation with employers about the lack of appropriate skills in the labour force. There are some sectors of the economy that are enduring very significant skills shortages just now. We have a particularly buoyant and productive and expansive oil and gas sector, and there are quite acute skill shortages, which is precisely why I announced the Energy Skills Academy proposal in the budget in September. The ways of tackling this, I think, are pretty clear in terms of the government's actions. First of all, within the school system, we have to encourage a much greater focus on preparing young people for work and for employment, which, in connection with the point I made to Mr McMahon, that is one of the purposes of Curriculum for Excellence. Secondly, we have to take some action to remedy long-standing problems about the interest of our population in science, technology, engineering and maths, the STEM subjects, and that has now been deployed within the school system, which will take some time to emerge, but undoubtedly is important that we do so. The third thing is that we've got to improve the dialogue between business sectors and those who are creating the skilled population. So in this respect, I disagree fundamentally with the point that's been articulated to you by a university, that it's nothing to do with them. I completely and utterly disagree with that point of view. The government has a range of industry leadership groups which cover a whole host of different sectors, and we have mandated those industry leadership groups to represent much more clearly and what are the skills requirements and skills demands that industry has. I think that system is now getting much better. I meet with the industry leadership groups on a regular basis, and there was a meeting just last week between ministers and the industry leadership groups, of which unfortunately I was unable to attend due to the need to answer a parliamentary question last week. But the Minister for Youth Employment represented my interests there, and we see a sizable improvement in the dialogue between industry and the institutions about what the skills requirements happen to be. So these are the steps that we are taking, but they are essential steps to deal with what I think is a legitimate issue of concern over the availability of skills within the labour force.
I mean, I accept schools is not obviously your main area, but do you think there's a problem that we have a lot of school teachers who were pupils, students, and then back into the schools? They've not kind of worked outside. They don't have that experience to pass on to young people.
I'm not sure about that point. What I'm sure is that for Curriculum for Excellence to fulfil its capability, whatever the background of these teachers, they have to be able to represent that that climate and that direction to young people within our schools. And I see very good examples in the schools of Scotland where they're doing very good work in encouraging employers to come into schools. To one issue that I'm particularly concerned about is to encourage a greater focus on entrepreneurship within the school population in terms of seeing that as an aspiration. And I go to these events in the lobby of Parliament where social enterprises come in from different schools, and I feel as if I'm being put through a very sustained sales experience with some of these youngsters that are coming in to do it, and it's great to see it. So I think the Curriculum for Excellence to me and to ministers is a great way of actually motivating the type of climate or creating the type of climate that will be essential to ensure that our labour market is influenced by a strong presentation of capable characters when they emerge.
Thank you. If I could just go back to the third sector as well, which has been mentioned a couple of times. It seems to me that on the whole there's a good relationship at this level between the Parliament and government and the third sector and social enterprises. However, I think we have picked up that at a local level it's more patchy. Now, I do think one of the big successes of yourself and others has been to stop ring fencing so that councils have more freedom now to focus on their priorities. But there is the feeling in some circles that some councils, will use their own a regeneration agency or whatever it might be to do the work, where the third sector would feel it's being excluded. And is anybody actually comparing the two to see, who could actually produce the better results?
I think there's good evidence of the effectiveness of third sector organisations in delivering outcomes for individuals in those circumstances, and that evidence. I would certainly encourage public authorities to follow that evidence and to plan accordingly. What we've tried to do with the third sector is to ensure that this issue is dealt with by embedding third sector participation in the work of community planning partnerships at local level. So the type of reform we've undertaken with the third sector has been designed to create a clear articulation of third sector interests directly into the community planning partnership, and to ensure that is influential in guaranteeing that the third sector is able to play a significant role in delivering key programmes at local level. Now, I watch this issue very carefully because obviously I hear much of the same type of commentary that Mr Mason has raised with the committee this morning, and it is something that I discuss with my local government colleagues to ensure that they are properly following the point I made to Jean Urquhart earlier on of this collaborative agenda at local level, finding the best organisation able to take forward the particular solution, which may be a third sector organisation who can straddle the interests of both a local authority and the health service at local level.
Roger, can I have one more point?
Yes, one
okay.
brief.
Just to touch back then on one other area, which was DWP and the Job Centre Plus. I get the impression there's been a slight improvement in the relationship between the Job Centre Plus and other local public sector organisations. But I just wonder if you feel that if they were more fully devolved, if we could make it more joined up, and the problem that Jean Urquhart raised, would be less likely to occur.
You have to look at this at two levels. One at the level of policy, and one at the level of operation. At operational level, we work very hard to try to make sure that everything is aligned as possible. So if I give a practical example of that, yesterday I was at the Halls of Broxbourne Task Force, which is obviously dealing with an acute employment problem in West Lothian, and Skills Development Scotland were there, as were Job Centre Plus. There is a very cohesive model of operation being taken forward to support the employees who are affected by the closure of Halls of Broxbourne. When you then look at the policy issues, there will of course be areas where there is a lack of consistency, and where we could deliver more cohesion and more focus if there was a policy approach coming from the same administration. So therefore the argument for further devolved responsibility, I think, is very clear in that respect.
So much.
Thank you. I just, Cabinet Secretary, want to take a wee bit of an issue with the Deputy Convener of the Committee, because we took evidence on the 9th of May from the Vice-Chancellor of Scotland University, Jim MacDonald, and he emphasised the fact that universities are in fact aligning themselves with economic imperatives. So
it was a different university I was referring to, so that takes one out.
I think University Scotland are
the point I would make,
the economic position we're in, and they are.
The point I would make, Convener, is that you know, it's essential, absolutely essential, that there is good and cohesive discussions between the industry leadership groups and the further and higher education sectors. I see that happening in a large number of areas. My point was that if that was their view articulated to the committee, then I disagree with it.
Yes, indeed. Gavin, to be followed by Elaine.
Cabinet Secretary, what should our expectations and the business community's expectations be for Skills Force? Is it an upgrade that consolidates some of what is there before and makes it slightly easier or better for employers to deal with? Or is it a genuine sort of one-stop shop where everything any employer would want to know about taking on a new employee could be found via that website? Where, in between those sort of two positions, where do you think Skills Force will sit?
I think that in the latter category.
So if you're, because we've obviously taken evidence from a number of businesses that gave us with similar sentiments to the small business owner from Glasgow, that maybe not quite as curtly and succinctly as he did, but
it was very effectively put, sort of searing effect on me, I can tell the committee.
But I mean, is it the government's view though that once this is launched, if we were to have this business owner in front of the committee in a year's time, he would say there is now a one-stop shop, and actually this is the only place you need to look at?
Well, that would be my hope, that was the case.
Okay. Can I come back to a statistic you put out earlier? I forget the name of the programme. You hopefully could remind me. 56% of people on the programme went on to sustained employment. Was that get ready for work? Or
that was training for work.
That was training for work. What can you just expand to the committee? What is, in terms of that percentage and in terms of the definition, what is the government's precise definition of sustained employment?
It will be continuous employment for 6 months after leaving that programme.
Okay. And does the government track, or does it intend to track, what happens after 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, so that particularly people who'd been furthest from the labour market initially, do you intend to, or do you track whether they're still in employment after 9, 12, 18 or further, or is 6 months effectively the cut-off point?
6 months is the only other point at which we judge is that person, have we achieved a satisfactory outcome from that programme? I think clearly there is there are other points at which you could try to assess that point. I think that you then get into territory about the scale and complexity of monitoring of employment patterns of individuals, which I think is a debate to be had, but I think it gets a bit it can become very complex.
No, fair, I mean, I take that on board, but I mean, is it something that if this committee concluded at the end of our work on improving employability, that it ought to be tracked for more than 6 months? Is that something the government would take seriously and listen to?
I think it goes without saying that will look very carefully at what the committee concludes on this inquiry, because I hope I'm giving the committee a sense this morning that the government has a range of different approaches to this issue, that we want to make sure that they are effective and that they have the effect that I am setting out to the committee the government hopes they'll have, But if the committee has areas where it believes that that could be made more effective, then of course I'll consider that very carefully.
Just one very narrow final question. In relation to the wage subsidy scheme that you responded to the convener about, you mentioned there was £15 million for 13-14 from the Scottish Government. And it's just your wording. I think you said you expect £15 million from ESF. I just want clarity on that. Is that guaranteed? Is it you hope for it? Or just where are discussions in relation to that, just so that I can be clear on it?
That approach essentially has to be cleared through the programme management committees that monitor decision making around European social funds, and that process is underway to secure the necessary resources that can support the programme.
Do you at this stage have an inkling of when that decision will be taken?
Well, it'll all be done in good time to enable the programme to be operational in 2013-14.
Okay, grateful, thank you.
Thanks. My questions, I suppose, arise from some of the things that others have been saying as well, in that the impression we got was that the public sector partners are working quite well together in the employability partnership. John Mason and I were in Dumfries speaking to various sectors there. But there was a perception from both the private sector and the third sector that the lines of communication with them were not as good. We had in evidence here members of the private sector who were concerned about the sort of support they were being offered by Business Gateway, and in the local session the private sector felt that some of the training which would help them, for example, one manager said actually for some of the small businesses it's actually management training which small businesses need in order to be able to expand. It's because people become managers without actually the background possibly that can help them to make their businesses more successful. Another example was the lack of training in hospitality for an area which actually is very dependent on tourism. There wasn't the ability to access training in the hospitality sector. And I just wondered, in terms of the way in which the Scottish Government evaluates the success of some of the programmes, the success of the employability partnerships, how do you look at the way in which the public sector communicates with the private sector and the third sector?
But before I come on to answer that question, can I just make a point about the Business Gateway, where if there are issues about the focus and the performance of Business Gateway and what type of services, because the point that Dr. Morris raises is a very interesting one, that actually what a small company might require more is not an employer recruitment incentive for argument's sake, but a bit of management training available through the Business Gateway. Well, that to me is essential feedback that we understand and take action about. Now, I'm pretty sure Business Gateway organisations around the country will be providing management support and development to SMEs, but if it's not obvious, well communicated, or all the other reasons it could well be, that's something we need to know about. Of course, that's material because of the stage that we are at in the preparation of the Business Gateway contract and service, which is at a critical point. So the solution to some of the employability issues might not actually exist in the list of employability initiatives that the government happens to have. It might be in the Business Gateway, and we've got to be, ministers must ensure that we have a broad enough perspective that we're taking into account these programmes and these approaches, and not just the list of employability programmes with a capital E. On the point about local employability partnerships, essentially we give guidance to the partnerships through the employability framework that I've set out. We are involved in regular dialogue with those partnerships about how they are taking forward their activities. Clearly, we are listening to the business community about some of the issues that they're concerned about, whether it's about availability skills that Mr Mason referred to, or the availability of information that Mr Brown was referring to, and as a consequence we change some of the systems and approaches that we put in place. So that's the way in which we exercise scrutiny in that respect. The final point about hospitality training in the southwest of Scotland, I think that's in a sense, is a good illustration of the point that Mr Mason was making about the fact that we need to make sure that provision in localities is what is actually required by the local economic base, which is why the dialogue between industry leadership groups and the agencies and the employability partnerships is so close to make sure that we get that right.
Mr Mason and I were at this at the same local session, so I think we're probably listening to pretty much to the same evidence. But I'll give you just an example. Is that in Dumfries and Galloway, the local employability partnership had an initiative which they believed would help to support businesses in terms of one-stop shop that they could go for advice and so on. It sounded pretty good, but when we went to speak to the private sector representatives, they actually perceived it as a threat, which was really rather worrying. That in some ways that process of communication is insufficient, and I think it probably relates to your experience with the individual who was a bit unimpressed with the number of initiatives that the public sector were coming forward with. There just seems to be this lack of communication there between the two sectors.
I think this is an area where I would be the first to admit that we have to make sure the communication is undertaken properly and effectively, and I would also be the first to admit that you can get that wrong, because it clearly there's lots and lots of things on the go in relation to employability, and I sometimes sort of sit in these discussions thinking to myself, well, we've got all this activity underway. Why are people telling me there's skills shortages? And that's the rather simple question I ask myself. Why is this? Because we're spending, in the whole field of education, training, out with the school sector, we're spending the best part of over £2 billion as a country. So the £2 billion question for me is, we're doing all that, and I'm still having conversations about people who say to me, we can't get the skills we require, or we don't know how to find out the information that's required. And what I hope I've told the committee is that we're very much focused on trying to resolve those points, because it's just not good enough if people can't get access to the information that they need, or that they can't get the skills they require in the labour market when we're spending over £2 billion.
Thank you very much. That concludes questions from the committee. There's a number of questions I would like to ask you, Cabinet Secretary, but I don't want to eat into the time of the next session. It has been a very interesting session that we've had this morning. I'd like to thank you and your officials for your presence this morning, and also for answering all our questions. So thank you. I'm going to call a break until 11:14 to enable members to have a natural break and get ready for the next session. Our fourth item of business today is to take oral evidence from stakeholders as part of the committee's scrutiny of the draft budget 2013-2014. I therefore like to welcome to the meeting Callum Chomchuk, I hope I'm saying that correctly, of Age Scotland, George Hosking of the Wave Trust, Margaret Lynch, Citizens Advice Scotland, Robin Parker of NUS Scotland, Ruchir Shah, Ruchir, okay, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, and Maureen Watson, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Now, committee members will of course know that we've been in these roundtable sessions on a number of occasions, but just how it actually works is that I will ask someone to start the session, and that will be Maureen Watson on this occasion, and Maureen will make any comments she may wish to make in terms of the draft budget and where she thinks we should be going or should not be going. And then what will happen then is that anyone round the table can actually can then contribute. You can either comment on what Maureen has said, you can put in your own statement, it's completely free what you wish to do. And the order in which people ask questions is simply the order in which I see people. There is no restriction on the number of times you can come in. You can come in once and then you can come in later on. If possible, you can hint if you wish to make a supplementary to some things, if there's a queue. It's a wee bit of playing it by ear to a large extent. You're looking a wee bit apprehensive there, John. I'm not going to bite you. But anyway, what I want to do, though, because we have about an hour and a half, is to, is to try and take things in some kind of structured format. So rather than just go into anything, we'll get three kind of main themes today. One is priorities for the Scottish budget, so we'll try and spend about half an hour on that. The second thing is inequalities and the impact of welfare reform. And the third issue is preventative spend. So if you can think about those areas in the first session, obviously the priorities for the Scottish Government would be the first one. So without further ado, Maureen, would you like to start us off with your comments? And remember, anyone, let me know if you wish to come in at any time. Okay, Maureen.
Thank you very much. I feel it's fortuitous that you've asked me to kick off, because what I'm going to say is that I think that housing should be the cornerstone of Scotland's preventative spending strategy. So I'm linking your first question with the third question, because for me and for our sector they are truly linked. In the written evidence that we've provided, we've listed a whole number of areas, and we've cited evidence to show that housing could be at the heart of your preventative spending strategy. Not just housing itself, which can obviously boost the economy at a critical time, but housing is needed by everyone. Everybody needs a home. It is particularly relevant to reducing costs in the health budget. If people have a home in which they can return to, they don't stay in hospital as long. In fact, they don't need to be kept in hospital, because the adaptations budget should allow for adaptations to be made. It should allow for sufficient wheelchair housing to be available in the communities in which people live as well. There's an organisation called Horizon Housing Association, who in a week or so is about to issue a report on the preventative spending benefits of wheelchair housing, and obviously make a plea for more funding of that type of housing as well. Whilst we welcome the fact that there's been a 40 million increase in what we expected to be the budget for housing and regeneration this year, and there's an additional, I think it's 30 million for energy efficiency measures, and we welcome that very warmly indeed. That doesn't go any way, first of all, to remedying the cuts that started in 2009, and I must say we do understand why those had to be made. We understand the environment that we're in. We're not trying to be ostriches with our heads in the sand. We totally understand it. We do firmly believe that our sector can provide you with one of the solutions that you need to delivering a true preventative spending agenda. If I can just say one last thing about the importance of housing in the Scottish budget. We don't feel it's ever got up to as high a priority as it needs to be, given the fact that it's at the centre of everything, and we'd like to see much more recognition of that. We're starting to hear that from the new ministerial team, which is great. We'd like to see that reflected in the budget. I'm happy to answer more detailed questions on that, but I point to the detailed evidence that we've put in the written evidence that we submitted, and we can supply more details.
John Mason.
Thanks. Yes, it was on to press Maureen maybe a little bit on some of that area, because I mean I totally agree that housing should be a priority, absolutely. But I wonder if she could clarify for us, I don't know, or later, you know, where that money should be coming from. I mean, I wonder, there's been some move from revenue to capital. Does she feel there should be more move from revenue to capital? Or is it, I mean, there was transport, I think the M74 was mentioned at paragraph 52, so is it that you feel there should be less on transport and more on housing? And also within the housing budget, is the feeling that we should be spending more on adaptations and retrofit and less on new build? Or is that not what you're saying?
It's to be a balance, because new housing, the supply of new housing, sustainable supply of new housing, is very, very important. In the current climate, we've got less money available per unit. If I could just underline the importance of grant to genuinely affordable social housing. Whilst the Scottish Government's target is for a certain amount of socially rented houses, we are waiting to see if the cut in grant that's been made over the last couple of years per unit will deliver what we would regard as genuinely affordable social rents. We've got some early data from the Scottish Government, which we're still analysing, and it is early data and it's only on projected rents, but there's some high rent figures in there for social rented housing. If I could just explain for some of the newer members of the committee, housing is expensive to build, it's expensive to rent or to buy. If you're going to make that housing genuinely affordable to people on very low incomes, there's got to be some sort of subsidy. There's just no getting away from that whatsoever. But so new supply is very important, and genuinely affordable social rented supply is much needed. There's 335 households approximately on waiting lists in the housing association and cooperative sector in Scotland just now. So that underlines the need for that new supply to be provided, and for it to be provided in a sustainable and affordable way. But all of the other related services are important. Adaptations are important, as I said earlier, about allowing people to return from hospital sooner, or perhaps creating a situation where they're not in hospital at all and saving the health budget. So we would like to see some money from the health budget. Some of the money that's concentrated on crisis intervention wouldn't be needed to be spent if it was there in the housing and housing related budgets in order to provide things like housing support, adapted housing, wheelchair housing, etc. The other thing we would like to see more money spent on is tenancy sustainment initiatives. Some of you will be familiar in your own constituencies with the power of the wider role spending that is no longer there. It's been replaced by the People and Communities Fund. It's open to a wider variety of sources. We have early feedback that a number of housing associations and cooperatives are still getting those applications through, which is great news. But it's quite a small pot of money, and tenancy sustainment initiatives aren't being allowed to go through in their own right, only as part of a bigger project. Now, I don't think I'll need to underline this very strongly, but at this time, with the impending welfare reforms, I know we're going to come on to talk about that, there has never been a greater need for more tenancy sustainment initiatives so that our sector can help people to remain in their homes in what are going to be very challenging times ahead. I hope that goes some way to answering your point, and I'll happily chip in more later on.
Okay, Jean, to be followed by Elaine.
Small point, really. I just wanted to ask you, what kind of research do you do into the cost of building and alternative buildings? It seems to me that for a long time we've gone on building pretty much the same thing. We've got new initiatives in terms of building standards and standards of insulation and energy efficiency homes and so on. A lot of builders, and perhaps less so builders, but architects will say that it is possible to build efficiently, well insulated homes at less than £100,000 a unit, or 120 or whatever. And that argument never seems to be being made by housing associations.
I think the sector prides itself on being extremely innovative and willing to look at anything that might bring a solution to the table, and have been leading in Scotland on providing energy efficient homes and taking advantage of the renewables opportunities that there are, and will continue to do so. We get a lot of our information from the Scottish Government about the costs that go into the schemes that are being built on the ground just now. So the figures that we quote are the ones that have come from the Scottish Government. But a lot of our members are starting to look at off-site production, for example, which can build homes more cheaply. But you also have to think of the kinds of communities that you're trying to build. And do you want a sort of pattern book approach, or do you want to build warm, safe communities with a variety of different house types there?
By Jamie.
I could just very quickly comment on the point that Jean raised, that actually it appears to be the case in other parts of Europe. Housing can be built considerably more cheaply than it is here, and I just wonder whether there's international examples that could be helpful there of ways in which savings can be made. But the point really that I wanted to ask you about is you've given us evidence about the problems of housing associations in terms of being able, in terms of lending and the level of subsidy, and actually being able to build houses that they can then rent out at an affordable rent. I wondered, is there actually any evidence that housing associations are coming to the point when they actually can't access the funds which are available because they're not able to build houses that which they can then let out? And secondly, whether is it just more money that you would like on housing, and I have sympathy for that? Is it, or would it be actually an increase in the level of subsidy? Would that actually do more in terms of housing associations being able to access the funding available?
Let me put it this way: if you were to say, would we take the amount of money that's available currently, if the level of subsidy was more for each social rented unit, we'd take that. We'd obviously want both, but we recognise that the constraints on the Scottish budget. But we cannot deliver genuinely affordable social rated housing at the current rates. Our members' feedback to us is that we're reaching a point where those who are doing it currently will no longer be able to do it. We're hearing stories every day of housing associations and cooperatives standing back from development until things begin to change in the financial climate. But the downside of that is you start to lose all the skills in the sector, and the sector's got a long track record in this area, and it would be sad if we lost that sort of expertise.
So even if there was not the ability to access additional funding, it would be appropriate to make a recommendation that even within the pot of funding which is there, that the levels of subsidy should be increased.
A higher subsidy per unit for social rented housing would be very warmly welcomed indeed. On the point of international comparisons, we do take every opportunity to go abroad on field trips where we can afford to within the Federation, and to look at examples. There's good examples in Germany. There's a member of my team about to go off to Copenhagen to look at housing there and the use of renewables. And we do that regularly. We use our sister federation, the National Housing Federation. They've got a European worker, and we keep in touch with things through that. There are a lot of good examples out there.
Just before I let you in, Jamie, just to remind everyone around the table that this session is about looking at the scrutiny of the draft budget and whether spending decisions align with the Scottish Government's overarching purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth. So, although we've had a wee discussion there on housing, please feel free for anyone else to say where they think the Scottish Government is doing things appropriately or not appropriately, and where you think alternative spending should go. So it'll be Jamie to be followed by Callum.
Yes, I actually had a question following on from what you said about preventive spend, but maybe raise that later, given that that's a section we'll come on to later, Convener. But something occurred to me of what you just said there, Maureen. I'd be interested to know where these housing associations are stepping back from development, because in my area, the local housing association is taking forward an extensive programme of house building.
Yeah, most people are trying to make this work. Most organisations are really trying to make this work, but they're saying to us it's not sustainable much beyond the next 1 or 2 years. But we're actually collecting evidence just now on exactly that, and what tests do people use to decide whether they're going to continue to develop or not in the current climate. We'd be happy to provide every member of the committee with that information as soon as we have it. We should have it in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Callum, to be followed by Gavin.
It was building on Maureen's earlier point around adaptations. I think the budget line in the draft budget, the support and transitions budget, is reduced from 32.2 million to 21.1 million. So that's a significant reduction to the budget line support and adaptations. And that's at a time the government's 2010 report looking at the demand for adaptations is expected to rise from 66,000 in 2008 to 106,000 in 2031. So we're kind of going at opposite ends. We're cutting the budget at the same time we're going to see massive increase in adaptations for homes. And that does go to the sort of the heart of the government's ambition to keep older people sort of safe and getting independent and living at home for as long as possible. And you asked Maureen earlier about the tension between building new homes and adaptations, and that is a real challenge. Clearly, the average cost of adaptations can be around £3,000, and so where possible, it's a much more cost-effective way to actually support people in their home for as long as possible. It's just at this point to see the budget line get cut at a time when the elderly population are needing these adaptations more. There is obviously a concern that right now adaptations are an expectation of 20% of the cost a lot of time will fall on the homeowner, although there's difference across housing tenure. And while that can be appropriate, there is, I think, a difficulty for everybody involved trying to actually get a lot of homeowners to actually be willing to take on these costs. A lot of them feel that, no, it's not their responsibility, the state should be paying for it, which ultimately they have the right to refuse the adaptations, but ultimately the state will pay for it if indeed they actually have a trip or fall and are forced to go into hospital or residential accommodation. So just a couple of thoughts to raise around the budget line.
Indeed. I mean, the Deputy Convener made a point earlier on when he was speaking to Maureen about. I think what is important is that when we look at the draft budget, we have got a fixed budget, and I think it's important that everyone thinks, well, if we're going to actually, if we're concerned about reductions in expenditure in one area, how would we actually fund that, for example? And Maureen did actually comment on where she thought some of that funding could come from, so that's just something I want to throw into the mix. Gavin, to be followed by Robin.
Just a question I wish to pose, Convener, and I suppose I look in the direction of Richir when I ask it. What does the draft budget 2013-14 mean for the third sector? What are the positive parts of it that you might draw out, and what are the negative parts of it that you may also draw out?
I'll let you respond to that directly before I let Robin in.
I guess for us, really, the starting point with the budget is what is it for? And for us, the whole point of the government's budget, the £30 billion budget, is it should be for social and environmental outcomes for people and their communities. That is always the starting point for the third sector. And I think that is probably why you've seen in our responses and in our public statements why we have been quite critical of the overall emphasis that, the aim, how do we make sure that the budget is contributing to the overall mission that the government has for economic growth. We would argue it's actually, from a third sector perspective and the values we're trying to represent, it's the other way around. The economic growth, the economic building and rebuilding our economy. And I'll just say for starters that I do not actually believe in economic recovery, because I think the kind of economic model that's got us into this mess in the first place isn't actually worth recovering. I think we need to rebuild our economy, but we need to think about why we're rebuilding our economy and how do we make it more meaningful for the outcomes for people and communities that we seek to support. And that is the mission for third sector organisations. So when you ask, what kind of impact would this budget have on the third sector, you will notice that there is a third sector budget line in there somewhere, which is about £30 million. Now, that particular budget line, to put it into context, is very valuable for us. It supports capacity building. It provides some core funding for some of the infrastructure that supports other organisations. But just put that in context, the third sector annually manages incoming resources of about £4.5 billion. So it's, that the actual allocation to the third sector is not what we should get too fixated on within the budget. What's important for us is the indirect resources coming through, for example, local authorities, which accounts for around 20%, 20 to 25% of the overall resources of the third sector. The overall income coming to the third sector from public funding generally is around 42 to 45%. So it's worth putting all of that into context. Now, having said that, in terms of the kind of allocations that we see specified, and of course you can't specify too much in terms of local authority procurement allocations, in terms of the overall allocation specified, we would be very supportive of some of the comments made by the SFHA, Age Scotland and others about the emphasis on housing and the emphasis on advice and other areas, because one of the things that we have said right along since last year is that the welfare reform proposals, UK welfare reform proposals, I'm afraid to say, has blown a hole in the spending review, a complete hole in the spending review. Now, to some extent, there's been some attempts, and we very much recognise that, and we welcome some attempts from the cabinet secretaries to try and address some elements of that. For example, the the additional money added to the social fund and crisis loans, which I think is very welcome. But the only way in which we're going to mitigate this is if the government takes a different approach in terms of how it spends the budget, not how much. I think we tend to get too focused on how much, how many millions put here, how many millions put there. And to be honest with you, I mean, the room for manoeuvre in this kind of budget, when you take into account the NHS and the money given to local authorities and so on, the room for manoeuvre is quite slight, and so we tend to get a bit too much focused on a few million here and a few million there. So for us, the important factor here is how the money is spent. And we would argue that the answer to how the resource should be spent needs to have an emphasis on preventative approaches and community-based solutions. Now, the interest for us as a third sector, of course, is that where prevention and community-based solutions meet is where the third sector tends to operate.
Robin? To be followed by Michael.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for having the opportunity to be here today as well. I suppose where I wanted to start was in terms of if there's overall government priority about addressing economic and social good and trying to boost that as far as possible. The extent to which I think the priorities within the budget reflect that is where I was going to start. And to me, one of the key things that Scotland has, and I suppose almost Scotland's biggest natural resource, is its people. And the way that we can make sure that we get the most from that natural resource is very much by investing in our human capital. And the way we do that is through education. And I think the other one I was going to pick up on in terms of priorities is also the issue around youth unemployment. That's something that the government's really identified on, and it's something that you've discussed earlier today. And I think it's worth saying that very much at NUS we represent a very wide age range in terms of students. It's one of the advantages of Scotland's education tradition is it's one very much based around lifelong learning, and it is unemployment more generally a problem that we face more generally, I think, in Scotland. And I think it's fair to say in the current budget, one of the things that the government has done is seen education as being a priority way in which to address the kind of problems that I've outlined and address them. And I think that's very much right, is to put such a focus on education. Now, the issue, I think, for us is that there's some very good things happening over on the university side of things. The government is putting extra public money into universities, making sure that universities can play their part in terms of contributing to tackling the problems that I've outlined. Where that's not being replicated is in terms of the college sector, and we're very concerned about the impact of the £34 million cut to colleges that this budget proposes, and we think that colleges have a hugely important role to play in terms of delivering some of the kind of key skills areas that Scotland has. They deliver a hugely wide range of kind of courses that address these skills areas. They very much help in terms of getting people into meaningful education that can lead to long-term job prospects increasing. And so I think we think that, and I'll maybe come back to some of the other more general areas of preventative spend when we move on to that. So I think education has been reflected in terms of being a priority, but that needs to be one that is both for universities and colleges, and we need to I think find ways to bridge that £34 million from draft budget to final budget, and I can highlight some ways in which that could be done if you like.
Go on, Lynn.
Sure. So the first one I'd start with is during the last budget process, the government looked at both funding colleges directly through the Scottish Funding Council, but also through other ways, and one of them was through Skills Development Scotland. And extra money was found. I think it's 17, but the exact figures in the evidence, 17 million was found between draft budget and final budget to go to colleges through Skills Development Scotland to deliver a proportion of the places that colleges deliver. However, in the proposals for this year's budget, what the government's simply done is moved money from the Funding Council to Skills Development Scotland to do this. So there isn't any extra money going to colleges in order to deliver these places. So it's how the money is being channeled has been changed rather than there being extra money. And so I think that's one option, is to look at Skills Development Scotland and other ways in which money in the Scottish Government's budget can be channeled through colleges because of the things that they do. Another one I'd highlight is there's very much a difference in terms of the level of higher education. Colleges also deliver higher education courses, and they receive a lower level of funding to do that compared to universities. Something which we think is has an impact in terms of some of the access to education, both in kind of local access, but also in terms of people who are furthest from education getting into higher education courses. College is also going through a very major transformation programme, and we think it's very important that colleges are properly funded for that, and money was found to support that transformation process during the last budget. Again, that could be something that's repeated, given the timescales mergers are currently going through. And I suppose the other thing I'd say is that in previous budgets, the government's sought to increase the number of places that colleges are providing in one way or another. And I think at a time of unemployment, in particular youth unemployment, and particularly in terms of addressing some of the skills needs and addressing some of the long-term economic outlook for Scotland, that is perhaps another area in which to think about.
To be followed by John.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's already been alluded to by Ruki here about the welfare reform impact, and unfortunately my committee is not going to be scrutinising the budget this year, so this is my opportunity to get some of the issues that have been coming in front of the Welfare Reform Committee to look at. We've made it absolutely clear we know that the budget that's been presented here is never going to fill the gap that's going to be coming down the road from the welfare reform changes. I think that's in the order of about £2 billion that's going to come out of the Scottish economy. So we know that what we're talking about here is mitigation, firefighting in some instances. But I just wonder if you know, we know that the Scottish Government has got a tight budget to work with. I don't know, and this may be a specific question to Margaret, are we leveraging in potential other sources of income in terms of big lottery funding, for example, which would be a huge benefit to advice services? I'm told that the Cabinet Office at the UK has made about £66 million, I think, is it, something like that, that's available, which isn't in the Scottish budget, but could come to the Scottish, or some of that could come to the Scottish budget to, you know, allow advocacy services and advice services to benefit beyond what's already been allocated to them, in terms of support for the elderly, for housing associations. We're going to have to see a reordering of priorities in those areas rather than trying to find more money for them. So I've just sort of thrown that out there from your own perspectives. But I think it was a specific question to you, Margaret, about the advice funding. But from the other participants, where would you like to see money reordered if it could be done in order to get some of that mitigation done, which currently we're missing an opportunity to do?
Well, hold on, just before I let Margaret in, because I'm going to move on to welfare reform just in a minute. I'm just going to let John comment, because I think he was going to respond to what Robin was saying, and then we're going to move on to welfare reform, and I'm going to move to Margaret first, because I was going to actually quote back some of her submission, and then and you can also respond to Michael, and we'll start discussing welfare reform, because Michael obviously is the convener of the Welfare Reform Committee, and Jamie Hepburn is a member too, so it's very much in our thoughts. John.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it was to press Robin just on some of the things he was saying. I mean, I think if there was extra money found, obviously, between the interim and the final budget and things, I'm sure a lot of us would support that going towards colleges. But on the kind of general mix of things, I just wonder, I mean, is he actually arguing that perhaps the universities have got slightly too much and we could take some of the university money and give it to the colleges? Or is it more that the whole education budget is really not sufficient and we should maybe pull some out of health, as was maybe hinted at, for housing? And then, although it's touching on preventative spending, I mean, there would be some people who would say, actually, by the age of 17 or 18, it's far too late. What we should be doing is taking money out of the colleges and universities budget and putting it into early years. Have you any thoughts around that?
I think it's about matching the priority that the government has put in terms of education generally, and seeing that replicated in colleges. So I'm not trying to play off different parts of the education system. I think, as I said, one of the advantages of the Scottish education system is that whether it's through having the Scottish Credit and Qualifications framework or other things, it is very much a lifelong learning process, and that is going to be increasingly important in terms of retraining people at points in their lives, or as Scotland's economy changes, we need to reskill and retrain people. I think what I would say, and it's something I was going to come back to maybe when we talk about inequalities, something we found from our own research over the last year or two, is that whether it's university or college, there is very much a role that they have to play in terms of right here and right now, giving people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they should be playing a far greater role in terms of giving people from those kind of backgrounds the opportunities that they've perhaps not had up until that point.
Thank you. Now, Margaret, in the submission from Citizens Advice Scotland, you say, and I quote, one of CS's main points in the response to the Scottish Spending Review 2011 and draft budget 2012-13 was that the impact of UK welfare reform changes had not been taken into consideration. We made the point that the Spending Review did not mention the changes which related to £2.5 billion being taken out of the Scottish economy over much of the Spending Review. We stated that at a time when public services and local authority funding was also being reduced, this was short-sighted, and this remains a major area of concern. So it was to ask you to comment that and lead us off on this section, and also to respond to the comments that Michael has made. And again, I would ask people around the table to please let me know if you wish to make a contribution.
Okay, thank you, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm going to confine my remarks to the impact of welfare reform, what can be done in mitigation, and also I'll address the funding issue that Michael raised. One of the things that really troubles me about this whole discourse is that welfare reform is often spoken about as if it's on a distant hill. And actually, for people in the Citizens Advice Bureau, it is a burden that we've been carrying really, for the last year. In the last year alone, we've seen a 62% increase in the number of tribunals that we've represented clients in. The vast majority of them have been on welfare. We've seen an increase of 61% in people presenting with problems related to the employment support allowance. We've got a really good track record, of delivering for clients when we represent them. We've a nearly 70% success rate compared with 40% if people go on their own. Last year alone, we spent 1,500 full-time working days advising clients on welfare reform related, on employment support allowance related issues. Form filling for clients up 200%. We have done some modelling of what we think is coming down the line between 2013 to 2017, when the full impact of welfare reform will be upon us. And we're looking at roughly 600,000 claims being adversely affected. Now, given that 1 in 3 Scots comes to a Citizens Advice Bureau when things go badly for them, we, at the very, a very conservative estimate is that we're going to have to deal with an additional 200,000 issues every year. Now, bear in mind that last year we dealt with 190,000. It means that we're going to have to effectively double our service provision in a very, very short space of time. That's clearly a very difficult thing for any organisation to do. I've been spending the last few months, because obviously I'm new in post, going around visiting the various Citizens Advice Bureau, and I have to tell you, I see signs of stress everywhere I go. The Bureau at the moment are working at the outer edges of what their capacity is in terms of what their premises contain, the volunteer recruitment and retention that they can support. Our volunteer advisors are asked, really, initially they're supposed to be generalist advisors, they're now providing specialist services. In relation to mitigation, and I suppose this also touches on preventative spend, last year our client financial gain was £140 million. Roughly, the Citizens Advice Service in Scotland costs 21 million to run. So we've got, if you like, a return on investment of for every £1 spent, £7 comes back. But that masks a broader figure, which is that the people that we see and that we're able to help, and we can put money back in their pockets, are then less likely to present at social services or through health services for additional support. The other, I think, area where we provide, I suppose, a service is if you think about issues relating to the new proposals for universal credit, which will be paid monthly in arrears, our expectation is that we're going to see people presenting to us that would never ever have dreamt of, finding themselves in a position like that, before. When they want to apply to have the universal credit paid fortnightly instead of 4 weekly, we're the people who will be filling in those forms. We're the people who will be representing the under 25s when they have to appeal against cuts in housing benefit, and we'll be the people that will be representing people who are losing benefit when it moves from DLA to PIP. I think one of the things where perhaps the budget misses a trick is that whilst it has got money in the budget to help people with the social fund and with council tax, and that's really welcome, it doesn't really take account of the impact in the Scottish economy. And I think that's one area where what we do helps, because, to be perfectly frank, what we do, the client financial gain that we're able to get for people, puts money back into the Scottish economy, and very usually it's the local economy, because poor people tend to spend their money closer to home than those who are rich. In relation to the issue that Michael raised in terms of funding, in 2011, the government at UK, England and Wales got an additional 16.8 million to fund advice services in the transition from, if you like, the old welfare system to the new one. And that was given, I think 1.7 million was given over each year for 3 years in Barnett consequentials to the Scottish Government. And today we're waiting to hear what's going to happen to that money. Over and above that, there was an announcement made on Friday, from a joint announcement from the Cabinet Office and the Big Lottery, that there would be a £65 million support package for vital frontline advice services, because they recognise, again, that one of the best ways of mitigating the impact of welfare reform is making sure that people claim all that they're entitled to, that they get representation so that unfair decisions are challenged, and that through client financial gain, money can be put back in people's pockets. Over and above this £65 million support package for the frontline advice services, Big Lottery have made an additional £31.7 million available for money advice. So if you look at England and Wales, they've had, if you like, a support package for advice services totalling very nearly £100 million. And that hasn't yet happened in Scotland. Now, that said, we are in discussions with the Scottish Government and with their officials. We've presented a proposal to them for, and I think it's an additional 2.5 million. Of that, 2.3 would go direct to the Bureau. And the idea behind that is that would be about increasing the number of advice hours that are provided at a local level. Obviously, there's a budget process in place, and we'll need to wait and find out what the outcome of that is. But I have to say, I do regret the fact, I regret it deeply, that these conversations weren't being had a year ago. I know of no organisation or business who can plan, put in place the architecture to support and deliver effectively a doubling of the service provision without any resource input. So that brings me, I suppose, to my final point, which is about coordination. I mean, coordination is going to be everything here. And we've had I think there are disparate conversations going on in different places. I meet regularly with the DWP, and we have a very good relationship with the DWP in Scotland. We're working together. Again, this is about mitigation. We've been meeting separately with the Scottish Government officials who are spread across, I think, 3 different teams. And then there's COSLA and there's our colleagues in SCVO. So yesterday I just thought we need to really bring everybody together so that we can plan what we're doing much, much better, so that whatever resources are down the line in relation to mitigation are deployed to best use. So we've invited with Richard Cornish and the DWP, the Scottish Government, the Access to Justice team, the Third Sector team and the Welfare Reform team, COSLA and our colleagues in SCVO to come to the table so that we can start looking at this planning and coordination. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, you know, we really have to hear something from the Scottish Government in the not too distant future, because otherwise we won't be able to meet this huge rise in demand for advice provision that is not coming down the line. It is here already.
Jamie.
Thank you very much. Can we have a specific question for Margaret, if I may, and then maybe a wider one, certainly for Maureen and Margaret, and others might want to comment. I was interested to hear you say, Margaret, I think I'm rounding the figures for sake of ease, but essentially you're saying £7 is gained for every pound that's spent, £7 is gained for your client base for every pound that's spent on the Citizens Advice Bureau across the country. Has there been any assessment of the likely ratio in future, given that the entire system of welfare is changing?
We are working at the moment with Fraser of Allender to map the impact of Citizens Advice services on the wider Scottish economy. That information isn't currently available, but hopefully, you know, it will be in you know, soon enough. I think that report's coming out sometime in the next 3 months, Jamie. I don't know what's in it yet, since I'm not close enough to...
We'll be able to see that as a committee and
absolutely.
Yeah. A wider question, certainly for Margaret and Monica's there, evidence refers to greater support, and indeed that was essentially what Margaret was talking about, greater support for advice services. I take it you would, both and others would accept, you know, this process has been driven by the Department for Work and Pensions. They're taking forward the process of welfare reform. Do you think it's incumbent upon them to ensure that greater resources are passed down for this type of activity?
Well, I mean, I think it's possibly a joint responsibility. I mean, you're absolutely right, Jamie. You know, this is welfare reform is being visited upon us by a coalition government of Liberals and Tories based in Westminster. You know, but anybody who thinks that any government of Scotland could not act, you know, you can't take a big boy done it and then he ran away as a defence here at all. The Scottish Parliament was set up because, I mean, the whole motivation behind the Scottish Parliament was because during the 1980s we wanted a dented shield approach in the event that any government of any complexion was attacking, if you like, the social base in Scotland. And I think that any government, and this is not a political point, it cuts across politics. There is an expectation in Scotland that we are a communitarian society, and we expect the poorest, the weakest, and the most vulnerable people here to be protected. And if the attack comes from decisions that are made in England and Wales, if a defence is possible in Scotland, we expect it to come from Scotland. Now, we're not arguing that the Scottish Government or any other organisation can replace £2.5 billion. You know, absolutely not. But where Barnett consequentials have been offered and have been, you know, and that money has been made available to the Scottish Government, I think it's reasonable to expect that that money should then translate into additional support for advice provision.
I point to sort of widen it specifically to each concern and to the housing associations. Yesterday, as part of our work programme, the Welfare Reform Committee visited the pilot project that's looking at universal credit coming here. And I won't go into any of the details because a lot of what they told us was commercially confidential and it's part of the project. But I think one of the most significant things that struck me was that the Housing Association, in purely dealing with the changes that are coming through, the support that they're having to give to people who are finding their circumstances changing purely because of changes in criteria, people who currently get benefits will no longer get the same level, people who are going to find themselves in difficulty because the money is going to go directly into their bank account, that's going to incur charges and all sorts of stuff. I mean, just purely because of these changes and nothing else, the cost of running that project is a huge burden on that housing association. Now, while it's a pilot, it's going to be sustained in that. The funding that they're going to incur to do that is going to be met. But when this becomes the norm, and every housing association, every social landlord is going to have to implement these changes, that funding will go and everyone will have to meet the costs from their existing resources. Now, multiply what this organisation has had to find to run the pilot project, I wonder, has any of that resource implication been taken into account in any of the planning that's been done? Because we've talked about what's going to happen to the citizens' advice, money advice, and what have you. We've talked about aids and adaptations. We've talked about the support that's going to be required. But has any of this been factored in? Because I think the figure is going to be astronomical, and the changes that are going to be brought forward, when they actually start to be implemented, are going to create carnage in terms of the implications on housing associations, social landlords, councils, and the services that they provide. And I just wonder, with social services, the impact on them is going to be absolutely astronomical. And I haven't seen any evidence yet of that having been factored into the equation in the budget.
Okay, do you want Margaret to respond to that, or Maureen?
Margaret's given us a perspective on the people who are going to be affected and where they're going to look for support.
Yeah.
And at the present time, that organisation has a dedicated citizens' advice worker who's working closely with all of the people affected. But when that goes Scotland-wide, when he's talking about Edinburgh working with one project, when that goes across Edinburgh, what level of support is going to be available? So I take that point. But it's in terms of elderly people, kinship carers who are going to be penalised for bedroom tax, these types of instances. Has any of that been factored in, Callum? I just don't know if you've taken any analysis of that. And it's, based on what we heard yesterday, certainly the SFHA, have they?
I've got three people who could respond to that. You've directed that directly at Callum, so I'll let Callum and Maureen and Margaret in, and then I know Elaine wants to obviously come in as well.
Short answer, no. I think, but the evidence you said from the pilot is actually quite telling. That we run our own helpline, and what we found, we've actually physically doubled the floor space and capacity over the last year. We're finding that it's increasingly younger and younger people actually phone. Traditionally, an older people's helpline, you'd imagine it's people 75 and 80. It's more and more a younger constituency phoning, because the fear about welfare reform is more and more pronounced. And I think we're talking about how to mitigate the impact of it. I think the cuts to the local authority budget in particular could help exacerbate that. We're talking about information advice, citizens' advice offer, but local authorities provide a lot of benefit uptake support for individuals. Partly that's to help get back some of the money through care charging, but there is a big support from local authorities to help benefit uptake and advice, and any cuts to the local authority budget will have an impact on the actual potential incomes of a lot of older people and disabled people across Scotland. So I'm not really giving you a solution about where money is going to come from, unfortunately, but it's more there is that threat that as the local authority budgets get squeezed a bit more, that real frontline advice will also get squeezed, and we'll find that the return to the local economy and the impact on individuals will be all the greater.
Maureen?
We're extremely concerned about the whole impact of demand on advice services and the whole issue about communication from DWP over this whole agenda. We think that communication from DWP has been extremely poor, if not appalling. During the passage of the Welfare Reform Bill, we found it quite hard to get any but the most willing of DWP officials to come up and talk to us about what was coming down the line during the actual lobbying phase. Now we're into the acts there, and we're now into what we're calling internally as our damage limitation phase, which is assessing the impact and looking to provide the tools that our members need to cope with this. And we're only just tipping at the tip of the iceberg here. My Chief Executive, Dr Mary Taylor, spoke to this committee about the work that we've done on measuring the impact of welfare reform earlier this year. And you'll probably remember the big figure that she quoted, which was £220 million. A company that we've commissioned has estimated, and it is a guesstimate, but it's the nearest we can get to it, is going to be taken out of the household incomes of tenants living in our sector between the housing benefit changes coming in April 2013 and then taking account of universal credit being rolled out up to 2017. That's a huge number in terms of finances. It's a huge number of confused and potentially confused people out there. There's been a long tradition in our sector of tenants coming to the housing officers for advice on filling out housing benefit forms. Housing benefit's now going to be rolled up into universal credit. In fact, in April, it's going to be part of, you're going to have the bedroom tax, and you're going to have the potential of the benefit cap affecting we think around 1,800 of the tenants in our sector. Small amount of people, that second thing, that the benefit gap, small amount of people, but for each individual household being affected by that, it's a big, big sum of money. Some of those figures were in the evidence that we gave you earlier this year, in which you asked questions of my chief exec on. But we could reissue that evidence if you want. You've probably got it stashed safely. But we are trying now to refresh a survey we did earlier this year on preparedness of everyone in our sector for what's coming down the end of the line, and that includes housing staff to provide advice services, and we'll be limited to just what's housing related, because we can't do what you're doing, Margaret. I mean, we wouldn't want to replicate, but I guess if we should be joined up, so we'd be willing to come into what it is you're setting up as well. We're about to refresh that survey. We'll have some numbers against that, which we will happily share with the committee. We'll be doing this before Christmas, so we'll bring some numbers to the table.
That'll be very useful. Margaret, before we Elaine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the real need here is for coordination. To the best of my knowledge, Michael, there hasn't been a proper impact assessment done on, the full impact of welfare reform in a rounded sense. There's a kind of fragmented picture that's available to us. I chaired the Capita conference earlier on this week on welfare reform, and what was really interesting about that event was it did give you a bit of a kind of a helicopter view, and it was as a result of the discussion at that conference that I decided that we really need to have a high level coordination group. The local authorities need to be setting up their own welfare reform planning groups. They have not. It's not just that the transaction costs of the housing payments are going to increase. Where before a direct payment didn't cost the council anything, now to take that money out of people's banks will cost the council money. It'll cost them additional money in terms of collection for people who fall behind with the rent. There's the question of rising homelessness and how you cope with that. There's also going to be increased pressure in social work departments, social care, as kinship care arrangements break down, and then with £1 billion being taken out of the hands of people who are sick and disabled, who's going to pay for the care? The care costs that are paid for at the moment through that avenue. From our point of view, we are trying to reshape our model of advice provision and look at the CABs more as a hub in a local community, so that we're able not just to give people advice and information, but that we're able to refer people who are frankly destitute, to other organisations and sources of support, whether that's for a food parcel, emergency housing accommodation, a starter pack, if they're obviously not getting money through social fund payments and whatnot. But certainly we do need to be, as organisations who are in the business not just of advocacy but actually of service delivery, this doesn't happen by sitting around the table talking about it. You actually need to have proper planning mechanisms in place. The architecture of the services that you're going to deliver needs to change, for all of us. We need to be talking to each other about what's happening on the ground. One of the things I think that CAB Service is uniquely placed to do is we can report in real time what the impact of welfare reform is as clients walk through the door, and that information can be given to local authorities, it can be given to the Scottish Government, and then, if you like, at the coordination level, a more, if you like, context related response to welfare reform can be delivered. I think that probably the reality is that we can guess what's coming down the line, but we won't know until it actually happens, because three human beings faced with the same situation will react to it in three different ways, and in a sense we can do as much modelling as we can. We can share as much information as we can. We can predict an awful lot. We can put service changes in place to try and cope with that, but until it happens we don't really know how it's going to impact on people. And at that point it's going to be really, really important that the information that we can provide to local authorities, to COSLA and to government about how these changes are impacting on people on the ground is going to be an absolutely critical element of mitigation and recovery.
Elaine, to be followed by Jamie.
The comment I wanted to make really was on this issue of coordination, certainly aware that locally that there's 3 organisations, including the local authority, who give benefits advice. There's specialist organisations like Age Scotland and the CARES organisations and so on. Somebody can end up going around several organisations seeking the same type of information, obviously housing associations and so on. I just wondered whether there is actually a role, even in terms of funding for local national government, in terms of assisting that sort of coordination to take place, so that you actually have somewhere which is central and then is able to signpost people to the organisation which is most able to help. And if that might be something which would mitigate some of the pressures on the advice organisations and actually be a fairly effective expenditure of funding in order to do that. And I don't know whether it makes you feel any better, but I've certainly found the numbers of people coming to me for employment welfare-related advice has gone up a lot as well, and I'm sure that's just a reflection of what's happening.
I'll respond to that, Margaret, before I let you.
I think that local coordination is really, really important, and probably the best vehicle for that is through the local community planning partnerships. But I want to just give you an example of where things are not working too well, and I hate to say it, Michael, but it's in your patch. North Lanarkshire Council, we were absolutely delighted when North Lanarkshire Council announced that they were delivering an additional £750,000 for advice provision to cope with welfare reform. And then we turned around to look and see, where was that money going? It was all being retained within the local authority to effectively redeploy housing officers, and that's absolutely fine. But I think there should have been a conversation between North Lanarkshire Council and the Citizens Advice Service to say, that okay, how are these people best deployed? Now, we have got consultants' report after consultants' report that says when people are in housing arrears, they're reluctant to go and get benefits advice from the organisation to whom they owe money. And that also, because our advice provision is delivered through a network of 3,000 volunteers, for every pound that you spend, we can see more people. So what we would like delivered out of that effectively is whether or not those people can be redeployed through the CAB service, because that will result in a larger number of people in North Lanarkshire getting access to advice. And those kind of conversations are happening in some places, but not in others. So from that point of view, anything that the Scottish Government or COSLA can do to encourage the community planning partnerships to be the vehicle whereby that kind of local coordination happens is really, really important. The other thing that we are doing is, in the funding submission that we made to the Scottish Government, is that we've asked for some money, I think it's 200,000, and what we'll do with that is that we will train people in other agencies, whether it's housing officers or people who are working for disability organisations, people who are working for housing associations. We will train them to deliver first-tier welfare benefits advice. And the idea behind that is a kind of triangular model where people who are, enabled to self-help if they can. If they can't, with a bit of assistance from us, probably over the phone, they might then be able to complete the journey themselves. Train people in other organisations so that you spread the load, and that the people who eventually are dealt with by face-to-face advice would be people who are very vulnerable or who have complex needs.
Chair. Can I say, representing North Lanarkshire constituency, maybe a more reluctant enclave of North Lanarkshire than Michael McMahon represents. It was interesting to hear that evidence, but I want to ask about a slightly different issue. It's to do with the under-occupancy penalty for housing support, the so-called bedroom tax that both Michael and Maureen have referred to. And indeed, this is a question specifically for Maureen, because it's quite clear that the evidence tends to lead to the conclusion that we're going to need significantly more one-bedroom, single-bedroom properties in the socially rented sector in future, which seems entirely counterintuitive in terms of the flexibility that 2-3-bedroom properties afford that sector. I just wondered if you could comment on that area and whether or not through the budget process the sector is going to be geared up to try and deal with that issue.
Building smaller properties.
Well, yeah, indeed.
Yeah, well, I think I've used this stat before, both at, I think it's the ICI committee, and I think Dr. Mary Taylor used it here. But by our reckoning, there's around 62% of tenants in our sector needing a one-bedroom property, but only 34% have one at this point in time. That stat's about a year old, but that's the nearest we can come up with it. Part of the preparedness that the sector's doing is actually profiling its tenants and finding out who's living in the properties, because once you allocate a house, you know at that point who's moving in, but you don't know how the households develop necessarily unless you're helping them with a housing benefit application.
What does that gap between 62 and 34% represent in terms of number of households?
I don't have that information to hand, but I can get it to you.
Yeah,
I don't have it at my fingertips.
Tens of thousands, obviously.
Yeah, it's a big problem. The stock isn't there for those people who are going to be suffering and paying this bedroom tax. It's just not like we've been saying this from the beginning. Okay. Yes, we could build more one-bedroom properties, providing the subsidy levels, right? But why? We're in the 21st century. You know, why should people be forced to have just one bedroom? Why can't they have somewhere for the children to study? And this links in with people being prepared for the route and further in higher education. You know, all that sort of thing. You know, why shouldn't we just take account of the fact that needs to move on? Couples don't always need one bedroom. They're going to have family, a lot of them. They'll need a two-bedroom house.
I know Jamie's keen to come in here, but we've got other people who want to speak, and I'm keen. I've got to watch the time, and I want to move on to preventative spend. So Ruchir is going to be next, followed by George. But Ruchir, I know you wish to intervene in welfare reform. Once you've spoken on that subject, though, I'd like just to remind you of a quote from your own submission, which says, although the change funds were a welcome contribution towards preventative spending, with concerns that this money is not being sufficiently spent on community-based prevention. So please feel free to speak on both welfare reform and this, and we'll be moving on to this preventative spend discussion, and George will be next.
Well, that's very helpful, Convener, because what I was going to say is almost bridging what we were talking about welfare reform with some of the discussion around prevention, and I will touch on the change funds. It really, my starting points are responding to what Michael McMahon said regarding mitigation and the budget and what can the budget do. And I think the reality is hitting home now, especially with the Chancellor's recommitment to a further £10 billion in cuts to welfare budgets within the current cycle, that there's not going to be enough money available in the public purse to mitigate the kind of demand that we're expecting to see, regardless of all the uncertainties that we still haven't bottomed out. And so, to me, this is going to be less now about mitigation, full stop, and it's going to be to some extent about adaptation. And there's going to be some quite hard times ahead. Now, I think if we kind of accept that we're not going to address and solve welfare, the response to welfare cuts through public budgets alone, then we need to think about where the resources are going to come from. And I think that was what your question was alluding to. I think my response to that would be there is some very interesting talk, thinking, and messages from our sector on how can we build on the assets that already are within communities, whether they're human assets, social assets, environmental assets, land assets, and so on. There's some very interesting developments around community energy and renewables, for example, which can help regenerate communities, and increasing examples even within your patch, and in the wider West of Scotland area, on urban approaches to regeneration that we can build on. I think these are areas that are within this, the remit for Scottish Government to support and nurture within our communities. We've also not talked about the role of credit unions and cooperatives and the role they can play in tackling some of the financial exclusion issues that are bound to skyrocket over the next few months. SCVO itself has made a proposition within the submission to the committee about a community programme, a much bigger initiative to try and tackle unemployment, which I think is quite critical to any kind of attempt to address welfare reform and welfare cuts. And we have hundreds of organisations standing ready to take on more people. There is demand for the services. There's demand for that kind of activity. Of course, we think about where we're going to get the resources from, and that bridges into prevention. But I think broadly, the message that I would be saying is that we need to kind of shift our thinking a bit in terms of, rather than just simply looking at what bits of additional funding we can draw from here or there within the Scottish Government's overall budget allocation, how can we realign the whole Scottish Government budget allocation so that it is designed to help Scotland adapt and support people in communities through austerity and the welfare cuts? I think so that would be my broader message. And when it comes to prevention, we do believe that there is a very critical role that the third sector can play in prevention, but we don't believe in prevention just for the sake of saving money, although that is the starting point for many officials, as quite understandably. For us, the whole point of prevention is that it focuses on the kind of outcomes that we want to see for people in their communities. And that's where our emphasis on community-based solutions, community-based approaches to prevention comes in. A lot of the kind of organisations and projects that you see in our sector don't actually get any public funding whatsoever. A good example that I won the Charity Award of the Year a couple of years ago was the Serenity Cafe, which a dry cafe for people recovering from alcohol abuse, which had no incoming resources from the state whatsoever at local or national level. All they wanted was a realignment of the way in which the public sector was operating so that they could do their job quite well and without any barriers. So there is work that we can do in how we take forward the Scottish Government's budget. As I mentioned, not how much, but how. So how can we make sure that there's conditionalities and stipulations on how the money is used, particularly when it's given to quangos and external organisations? How can we have more creative ways in which we can combine portfolios? I mean, why not put together, reoffending with employability budgets, for example, so that you can start, so that people will start to try and make the connections within that kind of portfolio. I mean, why not put together energy and regeneration? Why not put together transport and health, community transport and health? There's huge synergies to be made if we kind of are more creative about how we combine portfolios. So I think those would be my suggestions more generally. About in terms of the specific question you asked about the Change Fund. From what we saw of the Improvement Service's own findings and their analysis of how the Change Fund money had been spent, it was a very mixed picture. But we felt that the allocations for what we would call downstream prevention, which is much, much closer to the kind of community-based solutions that we're talking about, much more, rather than just money being used to kind of fill in budgets, existing budgets and existing holes with a slight kind of short-term preventative edge to them. The kind of much more longer-term focus on prevention was kind of missing from a lot of the Change Fund plans and the Change Fund allocations. And I think there were some figures given by the Improvement Service. I probably best not to repeat them because I can't remember them exactly. I think it was something in the region of 20-24% was actually in the kind of prevention that we would like to see, which is much more about community-based prevention. So I think that's where we're coming from in our submission to you.
Okay, thank you. Now, George, the Wave Trust is a very interesting submission, and you even had the phrase, "We are currently cautiously optimistic about the prospects for leadership and influence in local areas." Doesn't seem to be a lot of optimism this morning, so please feel free to contribute to this discussion in any way you see fit.
Thank you, Convener. And I'd like to address the issues of both inequality and preventative spending and link those to each other. Research at the universities of Mannheim, Oxford and Cambridge shows that differences in the prospects of children are identifiable at 3 months of age and become wider with each passing time from 3 months to 11 years and beyond. Professor James Heckman, who I think is well known in Scotland, has made a study of what it is that drives inequality. And he said it is not poverty that drives inequality, it's lack of skills that drives inequality. And he particularly draws attention to what he calls the soft skills, not just reading, writing and arithmetic, but soft skills such as motivation, such as perseverance, such as ability to work with other people in a cooperative manner, such as emotional self-regulation. These soft skills are learned in the home from interaction with the family before children ever go to preschool or kindergarten. And they're heavily influenced by the quality of early parenting. Hence, if we wish to reduce inequality in Scotland over the long term, I would say that the evidence very strongly shows that the way to do that is to improve significantly the quality of very early life experience that those children who are in the more challenged families receive. And that takes me to early years preventative spending. I was at a previous meeting of this Finance Committee with a slightly different membership when Tom McCabe, yes, when Tom McCabe summed up 9 months of taking evidence on the value of preventative spending in the early years. And he summed it up by saying that they had seen evidence stacked from the floor to the sky that it was the right thing for the Scottish Government to be doing. I'm delighted that since then the Scottish Government has picked up that baton. And the first thing I'd really like to say about the draft budget is an extremely positive one. I think the draft budget is very good and very strong in its repeated commitment to early years preventative spending. We find it in the strategic context, where it talks about investing in activities that will reduce future demand in public services and reduce outcomes, and embed a preventative approach via community planning partnerships. It's stated in the Health and Wellbeing chapter, prioritising prevention spend on support for parenting in early years, the £39 million in the Early Years Change Fund as the most effective way to address poor health, and the establishment of an Early Years Collaborative, a very important step. It's stated in the Education and Lifelong Learning chapter, where I talk about focus on preventative spend as a strong base for all children to develop, learn, and crucially achieve their potential. And it also talks about prioritising investment in the first years of life and states that that is what will have the biggest impact. In that portfolio, a new £20 million fund is set up, split between early years and early intervention. And they also talk about building on a national parenting strategy. And there are also references in the justice, infrastructure and local government sectors of the budget to the importance of preventative spending in the early years. So I'd just like to say I'm delighted. I work across the United Kingdom, but I'm a Scot, and I'm proud of the fact that Scotland leads the United Kingdom in its commitment to preventative spending, and especially preventative spending in the early years. I think that's wonderful, and I think it's something that we should carry forward in a really effective way, because I think it can be trailblazing. And indeed, Harry Burns tells me it's not only in the rest of the United Kingdom, but many other parts of Europe that are looking to see what Scotland is doing in this respect. I have a concern, however, and that is that we don't realise the scale of investment that's needed to do this effectively. If I look at the £39 million in the Early Years Change Fund for the draft budget, and let's take 11 out of the 20 from the Education Fund and say that's for early years, we're talking about roughly round about £50 million that's being put into moving this agenda forward. That's 1/3 of 1% of the joint health and education budgets. 1/3 of 1%. I've been co-chairing for the last 9 months a study jointly with a senior civil servant in the Department of Education in London and working jointly with the Department for Education and Department of Health, devising a detailed blueprint for how one would put early years prevention policies in place for children from conception to age 2. As a result of the conclusions that we came to about how to do that in practice, I started working with a big lottery, looking at the value of promoting early years preventative spending. And I'm delighted to say that one outcome that has come from that is that the big lottery in England has decided to put £165 million behind backing 4 major pilot studies of putting a blueprint of the type that I'm describing into practice. Now, if I look at the money that the big lottery is putting into that and compare it with what Scotland is putting in, roughly Scotland will be spending in its early years funds equivalent to what the big lottery would be giving to a city like Bradford in England. And I wonder if we really realise the scale that is necessary to make a significant difference, to produce a change. Now, I know the response to asking anywhere for more money to be spent is, of course, where will that money come from? And I'd like to provide a proposed answer to that. And I'm going to do so first by referring to some points made in evidence to you last week by Professor John Kay when he spoke to you. He said that preventative spending would involve spending more money now so that we spend quite a lot less in the future. He said we could make the Scottish population a lot healthier if we spent more on things that would make them healthier and less on actually treating illnesses. He said that the main items in which the Scottish Government spends its money is health and education. And critically and crucially, he said that in the first 7 to 10 years of devolution, there was a substantial increase in spending in health and education without any commensurate improvement in outcomes. Now, that does not surprise me. I was closely involved in Croydon in a project called the Croydon Total Place Study, carried out under the last Labour government. And that was an evaluation of all money spent on early years from any government agency whatsoever, including the HMRC, social justice, criminal justice, any area of spending. They put the entire budgets together and they examined how effective it was. And they came to the conclusion that a great deal of the current spending on health, education and social services was not being spent effectively. They stated that it was very hard to establish a link between investment and outcomes. And they recommended a redesign of spending based on creating solutions rather than delivering services. The biggest criticism of their own operations was the way it was focused on delivering services and not on changing outcomes. They calculated a return of £10 for every pound that they would spend on early years preventative spending by making a change, with the biggest gains coming from doing things differently, and also, they said, a need to stop some services and reduce the costs of others. So I think it is possible to do a great deal more. If we spent in Scotland on an early years change fund at the level that the big lottery is putting money into England on a population equivalent basis for the whole of Scotland, we'd be looking at something that is about 3% of the total education and health budget, including education and social work in local authorities. It doesn't seem to me that 3% is too much to spend. But even if that is too much, and I do not recommend doing that in one go, I think one could spend significantly more than the present sum and run a number of pilots in Scotland of true commitment to early years preventative spend, as the big lottery is going to fund in England, and I'm sure it won't be lost on members of the committee to think of asking if the big lottery in Scotland might make a similar grant to support work here, as their partners are doing in England. I think that would be something that would carry early years preventative spending forward to the benefit of reducing inequality, improving education and improving health in Scotland.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive contribution. Now, we have about 10 minutes left, so if people have got further comments they wish to make, now's your opportunity to catch my eye. I'll take Jamie and then Callum.
Thank you, Convener. It's actually is a question for Mon, because it goes right back to the evidence she gave early on. She suggested, for example, and it's good because obviously she's engaged, the SFHA are engaged with thinking about preventive spend, suggesting that money could be saved from the health budget by spending on refitting houses, and understand the theory. But I just wonder if there's been any attempt to quantify that, because it's all well and good saying, and you know, in theory we can save money, but you know, what are we talking about here? And you know, is it an ongoing kind of thing? Has there been any attempt to work out the figures involved?
Not in the way you're describing, which gives us an idea for projects in the future. But there is there is an extensively growing body of evidence about the social return on investment on things like adaptation, very sheltered housing, housing and support, that sort of thing, and of community regeneration as well, all of which helps to save money in the health budget, we would argue, and we're happy to bring those things to your table as and when they are published. The next one to come is the Horizon one that I spoke about earlier. I've mentioned the Beeld, Hanover and Trust one, and some of you were at our parliamentary reception a few weeks ago where Cunningham Housing Association published its report, or launched its report, on this preventative spending power of community regeneration initiatives. So there's growing as a growing body of evidence in that relation, but not in terms of quantifying across the board.
Okay. Callum, to follow by Robin.
Sort of building on what George and Rashir said about the change funds for preventive spending, I think we all absolutely welcome the approach from the government. The three, change funds are really welcome. I suppose the concern that we really have, and speak mostly about the Health and Social Care Change Fund, is actually while we have an £80 million pot this year and next year, and obviously everybody wants to see that increase, it's actually how do we use it and where's the money going and what the projects have been spent on. We detailed in our evidence that we've done a sort of slight FOI of the partnerships, and it sort of detailed a lot of what we'd a lot of spend on projects that really don't deliver frontline differences for actual older people. And it's a case of, well, we've got 4 years of these change funds, and actually how do we get the biggest bang for our buck? It's really a case of actually not so much looking at budget lines, actually strengthening the conditionality, ensuring that the money goes towards the partnerships and the partnerships are spending it in the appropriate way. Starting this year, there's supposed to be 20% allocated to carers, and I think the Parliament really supported that approach. But there was no real example that we're seeing 20% of the change fund money going to carers. So I think that while we'd obviously want more money for a change fund, I think if we can actually strengthen the conditionality, ensure that where we have evidence about what works, where it's adaptations, where it's community-based assets that actually really deliver on the ground, that these representatives in the partnerships are strengthened and supported to really have their voice heard, to ensure that they get a bigger share of that. Actually, that's change fund money, and it isn't just the NHS and the local authorities, perhaps understandably taking some of the money to actually fill their own gaps in their own budget because of sort of cuts over the recent years. And the final thing just around change funds, just to really stress is, I think for a lot of older people, the lack of accessible transport is really the tipping point that really pushes a lot of them into residential accommodation or hospitals. And we're really not seeing any real sustained investment in community transport. And this coupled with the sort of reduction in the bus service operator grant that community transport operators can actually draw upon, we're finding more and more community transport operators really struggling to actually get older people out and about and keep them independent.
Okay, now I know Maureen wanted to come back there, but unfortunately we're really pressed for time, so I'm just going to take Robin and Michael, who had previously indicated they wanted to come in here, and they'll be the final contributors of the day.
Thank you very much. Well, I think George made an incredibly strong case for why we should give every Scottish child the same, the right start in life. So I won't repeat any of that because I think it was incredibly strong. In terms of, I wanted to talk about what I think universities and colleges could be doing more in terms of preventative spending, and to start off by actually kind of going back to what we were talking about inequalities. And if you look at the background of those entering our colleges at the moment, something in the region of about 26% of college students come from the most deprived backgrounds in Scotland. If you look at the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation and the 20% most deprived backgrounds. So 26% are coming from the 20% most deprived backgrounds in colleges. And that's even higher if you just look at FE provision in colleges. You compare that to universities, however, and the figure is 12%. Just 12% of university entrants come from the most deprived backgrounds. And you look at some of our most elitist institutions, it's even worse. And I guess where I go with that is that what we need to do is we need to make sure that access to education at higher and further levels becomes much fairer. And our take on it would be not that universities can somehow do all of that on their own, but our evidence is very much that they could be doing much, much more. And that if someone has shown an incredible amount of potential, someone has done very well in a school where most of the people tend not to go on to university, it's a low-performing school. People do well in those kind of circumstances. They've showed huge amounts of potential, and they should be giving people like that should be given many more chances in universities. And where we go is that we think that not having tuition fees in Scotland and the continued protection of that through the spending review, the increases to financial support for higher education that the spending review also do, as well as the continuation of the EMA, are kind of the crucial building blocks for making access to education fairer. And now it's sort of time for this money that is going quite rightly into universities to be used to leverage out from universities more action, more activity from them to make access to higher education fairer. And I suppose lastly, I just say around in terms of preventative spending is just there's very strong evidence out there the further you allow people to go with their education, the higher their educational qualifications they have, the better their life chances are in every sense, and the more healthier they're likely to be, the less likely they are to go on to commit crime, and that all those kind of side benefits, quite apart from the things that we've talked about around economic impact and people being more likely to be in work and earning more. And even maybe just kind of a small one to leave as the last thing. I think we're now kind of pretty much off the Olympic bounce that we've had. I think, you know, the mood of the room is anything to go by. Not an optimistic outlook, I think, rightly so. But in terms of sport, huge numbers of people get introduced through education at every level to new forms of sport. And if you give people, I think that's just a kind of a microcosm of one of those things of if you give people the opportunity to be in education rather than to be in the dole queue. And I think my final message is that if people aren't being given the places in colleges and aren't being given high quality places in colleges with appropriate funding, and that's why we were so worried about that 34 million, is that it's almost inevitable that the next place they'll go is onto the job queue.
Thank you. Michael, the final words with you.
Thanks very much, Convener. I totally agree with George. I mean, we've been discussing the preventative spend agenda for a long time in this Parliament, but experience has also taught me that when you talk about it in the way that you did, and theoretically, all of the politicians will sign up to that. I mean, we've had things like the CARE report before when we talked about the blueprint for moving from acute services to primary care services to have more emphasis on preventative spend. We've seen it in terms of education funding, all the rest of it. And everyone signs up to it in principle. But what people actually mean is that they want what they currently have plus all of the preventative spend as well, and they don't want the budgets to be skewed from one to another. Because when it comes to practically implement that change, what happens is you get the placards outside the local hospital saying defend our services, when what you're actually doing is you're transferring the funding from an acute service to a primary care service so that in the longer term people will benefit. And it's just to sort of throw that again, as a point I've made previously, and I think this committee could actually serve a very strong purpose, is if we made that argument, that where we have agreement on these things, that we should encourage people to actually follow it through and not get the dog whistle attitude that comes when you actually try to implement the changes that everyone agrees should happen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Michael. And I regret that time is against us this morning, but I'd like to thank everyone, not only for coming along, but for very useful and informed contributions. At the start of the meeting, the committee agreed to take the next item in private. I therefore now close the public meeting and we'll have a recess for 90 seconds.